Today I'm here with Jeremiah, Jenne. We're sitting in my Airbnb room in a Hutong in Beijing, and I'm having Jeremiah here since I had the chance to see him once again after a few years.
Yeah.
And Jeremiah is a writer and an historian living in Beijing since 2002. Hi Jeremiah.
Hey Zev, how you doing?
Very official we are.
I know, it feels like this is very much like, state meeting.
Yes,
We're negotiating some kind of boundary or truce or something.
There was a lot of that going on in some of the Hutongs around maybe 100 years ago?
An earlier era perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. Alright, so I wanted to ask you, why did you come to China?
Yeah, that's a question my mom asked me a lot.
Yeah.
When I was in college, I really wanted to study history. I've always loved history. And, one of the things about when I was in college, which was, in the late Middle Ages, their registrations were done by going into the gymnasium at assigned times and running to a table and signing your name for the classes you wanted. And it just turned out that the history classes that were about U.S. history were just completely full. And so I kind of got shuffled over to the other tables, and I started taking classes in all other kinds of history, and I got drawn to Asian history. There were some good professors where I went to school that I really enjoyed taking the classes. My junior year, I did a year in Singapore doing a project looking at the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. After I graduated, I spent some time working in Washington, D.C., and then decided, maybe I should just continue my love of history, and I thought about what aspects of history and Asian history particularly interested me, and I've always been thinking about like China, but particularly thinking about China in terms of empire. And so studying the last empire of China, the Qing Empire, studying the era of imperialism in China. And of course, to do all of that, I was going to have to do work in the Chinese archives, but to do that, of course, you need to learn the Chinese language. And all of that eventually brought me to Beijing in about 2002. And for the first 2 years I was here, I spent much of my time just kind of, in intensive language programs, trying to get my Chinese speaking to some extent, but a lot of it was reading, being able to use documents up to some kind of like to good level. I knew how to say, the semi-feudal, semi-colonial state of China in the 19th century before I knew how to ask for ketchup in a restaurant.
What's a historian in Beijing? What your days look like?
So for the last few years, I've run a company called Beijing by Foot, and for a long time I was a full-time teacher teaching history for American students who were studying in China in a study abroad program. Kind of like the one I went to when I went to Singapore when I was at university. And so I still teach, but usually I only teach about one course a semester. So an average day for me probably looks a little bit like, in the morning, I'll sometimes have a class. In the afternoon, I'll be working with a group, either a school group, a group from an embassy, group of travelers, or maybe a visiting program from another country. And they'll want to do a program in Beijing looking at the history of the city. And so what I do, in some ways it's a little bit like being a tour guide, but with the idea of trying to create a lesson plan that's both something they want to learn and also based on an area that we're going to be visiting. So for example, if we want to talk about what's the impact of imperialism in historical memory in China today, what's this legacy of this thing called the century of humiliation? Why is this such a big deal in sort of Chinese nationalism today? Well, we could sit in a conference room and I could show some slides and we could talk about it, or we could just go out to the Yuanminyan, the old summer palace, and say, okay, this is this incredible imperial Disneyland that was being constructed, piece by piece, building by building for 150 years, and then a whole lot of white people just burned this place to the ground. And actually, that's not totally fair because the British did send also a lot of Indian soldiers to fight on their behalf. Let's just say the armies of the British and French wiped that thing to the ground. And, those ruins are here, everyone's here. They're kind of taking us in, this is the story. And so when we talk about it, it has resonance. And that's one of the reasons, too, why I've been here for a long time is as a teacher, when I was teaching full-time, and even now when I teach part-time, if you're going to teach history about China, the best place to do it is in China.
Right.
And the same thing too with being somebody who works in kind of educational travel and working with groups. If you're going to talk about China, if you're going to get people to appreciate China and Chinese history, let's do it here. Let's have these conversations, but let's do it at the site. So that's kind of what I spend a lot of my days doing.
Right. So you're basically immersed in history of China and Beijing and China, I guess, right?
It is. I mean, if I wasn't doing this, if I was say like at a desk job in back home in the United States, I would spend my free time, the weekends reading books about Chinese history, and so I mean the fact that I get paid to do this is just it kind of boggles my mind every morning.
Is China history more interesting than other countries' history, or is it? Or is it like every country has, I mean not every, but many countries have interesting history?
Well, I think with China, first of all, there's obviously a lot of it.
Right.
I remember in graduate school when we were taking our qualifying exams, and the people who majored in or focused on U.S. history were like, yeah, man, I gotta learn everything about the Gilded Age. I'm like, how long was the Gilded Age? I was like, a decade? I've got 5,000 years here, people. Come on. So there's that. But I think too, part of it is that, and this is, for people in China, this is of course, this is our history. This is, we know this stuff really cold, but it's amazing that you have this incredible body of history. This, thousands of years of events. How many thousands of years is a little bit of some dispute, but thousands of years of these events and historical figures who are as famous and as important and are still cultural touchstones in a way in China that, in the United States we have George Washington, we have, England, they have, you go back to things like King Arthur or, some of the queens and kings. In China, you have this huge pantheon of historical figures and events that, frankly, most people outside of kind of Asia aren't that aware of. And I just found that to be amazing. When you kind of come here and you're like, wow, there was all this history I learned about the rest of the world, and now there is almost this whole other universe of history. It's one of the things I've never really been. I mean, I've read a lot of fairly geeky Americans. I've read the Lord of the Rings, and I've read a couple of the Game of Thrones books, but I've never been totally into the whole science fiction fantasy genre, because it's why am I going to learn about this whole universe of history and mythology when there are actual on this planet whole sections of the globe that have an amazingly complicated and rich history, mythology that I can explore that actually has some relevance to real people. I
came here 17 years ago, and I don't. In the first few years, I didn't know much of the history of China, and after I learned some more of the recent history, 100 years, I became much less frustrated with things. It's I understood them better. Some things that I used to frustrate me, I understood why they're doing it, or at least I formed an opinion of why they're doing it, and it made me feel a bit okay, I understand.
I think that comes with both learning a little bit about the culture. I think also comes from just kind of talking to people and kind of being willing to hear the perspective. I remember once many years ago kind of complaining, as is not unusual among foreigners in China, about the reluctance of some of our friends and neighbors to wait patiently in line. And I had one of my older Beijing friends say to me once, he kind of said in Chinese, he says, you remember that 60 years ago there were two people. One person waited patiently in line, the other person got the food they wanted. Old habits die hard, just give us a break. And, he was kind of being tongue-in-cheek, but not, kind of at a point. And, one of the things I think I realized the most being overseas, not just in China, but just going overseas, is just how nerf, cushy, ridiculously white bread, easy my life was or is, given about where I was born and how I was brought up. And that was a total accident. And, I think one of the biggest mistakes that Americans make, although it's not just Americans, but that's kind of where I come from, is the thing where we go through, we kind of go through life
running a race and not realizing that there were reasons that we kind of got to start the race, 20, 30, 40, 50 meters down the track.
Exactly.
And then, I look at how hard people here work and the lives that they had growing up, and I realized that if I grew up here, they would have eaten me for lunch. Like I would have been just roadkill on their path. These are people I know, friends of mine in China. I would have been roadkill on their way to success, because I did not have to work in my life nearly as hard as people work here just to kind of get by. I mean, you think about, one thing I think about is like, it's a joke, there's a lot of people in China, right? And like when I talk to student groups, some people always ask me, they're like, so when we come to China, what's the one thing we got to be prepared for? I'm like, well, there's a lot of people here. And everyone laughs like, it's funny because it's like 1.4 billion people. I'm like, no, there's a lot of people here. Like for anyone who's here, your whole existence is influenced and determined by the fact that you are one mammal in a crowd of many, many, many other mammals. Well, think about just like getting on the subway. Imagine growing up where like everything any of us have ever had to compete for, like that place in school, the girl in your high school class, the job, anything like that. You were competing against 5-6 times the competition, or I would have had to compete against 5 or 6 times the competition I was competing against when I was back home. And that when I thought about that, right? And then I realized that people in Beijing can get a little pushy, shovey on the subway, and people waiting in line is something that other people do. And that as you said, once you start thinking about that way, you're like, all right, like I don't totally like it, but I get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, selfishness today, in my view, comes from not having it before, and now I have it. I don't want to lose it. It's mine. Stuff like that that I see from people. And if you learn the history of the last 100 years, I think your life in China would be a bit easier.
Well, I think so. I think, even in terms of like politics, you think about like, one of the things I've looked at, taking a look at the history is, all right, I come out of when I first came to China, like at the same time you did, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that surprised me the most was just like how supportive people here were of the system. Mm. And I grew up, I'm a product of like 1980s America. Like I was a kid in the 80s, and like I grew up with this thought that if you lived under communism, right, your life was just like this you were just miserable, and you were just waiting each day for Sylvester Stallone to show up and like liberate you and then feed you a cheeseburger. And and that was the way it worked. And so when I came here, and everyone's like, it's okay. And I'm like, what do you mean okay? Like, I'm not Sylvester Stallone, but I could probably get him on the phone for you. Like, is that something you want? And what I realized is that there were a lot of things about here, just like anywhere, that were not great. But one of the things I think surprised me the most, or when I started looking at history, I think really kind of changed my perspective, was that for the last 200 years in China, the worst things that have happened to China generally happen when the government's been too weak. You think about like the century of humiliation under foreign imperialism, culminating in the occupation of China by the Japanese. You can even make an argument that even some of the aspects of 20th century, things like the Cultural Revolution, occurred because the government kind of abdicated responsibility for governing society. If you look at it from that perspective, you think, okay, what's the worst that could happen? Well, in the West, the worst that could happen, at least in our Western political experience, has been like the rise of a Hitler or a rise of like, Stalin or something. So our political systems are chaotic, messy, ridiculously inefficient, contraptions that don't really work, but they make it really hard for somebody to seize total power.
Right.
Unless you have a bunch of crazy redneck friends who want to take over a Capitol building.
Yeah.
But that's another issue. So in our system, we're willing to put up with a lot of like craziness as long as it doesn't lead to tyranny. I think in China, a lot of people here, they feel like, well, we'll put up with a little bit more authoritarianism and, restrictions if it means that we don't have the kind of chaos that had beset us in the past or that sometimes we see in other countries. And I'm not saying I agree with that. I mean, what I'm saying is, that's not what I would choose for me. I don't
Right.
actually think that's the system of government that I think works best. But that's my personal opinion.
Mhm.
But when someone tells me that they feel differently, I may disagree with them, but I understand.
Right.